Thank you, James, and thank you for PMI-LA for inviting me to speak tonight. I am going to talk about project management in supply chains and in and around and how they relate to each other and some of the things that kind of go hand in hand with the two topics. There's a lot of different things going on about supply chains. You hear a lot about that in the news today, but a lot of people don't really understand, and that's okay because we're going to go through some of those things. So let me tell you a little bit about myself. I'm an operations and supply chain consultant. I've been doing that since about 2015. Prior to that, I was in corporate America with very large corporations. I started my career as a manufacturing engineer and worked my way into more supply chain type roles. At one point, after working for many years as an engineer, I went back and got an MBA. And I think I've been doing something about learning ever since. I have a green belt certification. I believe the last time I was here, I talked about Lean and Six Sigma. I have a couple of certifications in supplier management and supplier diversity from an organization called the Institute for Supply Management, one of about 3 large supply chain organizations. And I recently got a Scrum certification, which if you're familiar with that, it's used a lot in software, but it's also a kind of project management approach. So I have my company and that's what I do, but I'm also an adjunct professor in the CSU system. As James said, that's where we met at a CSUN event, where I teach part-time. I also teach at Long Beach and work with them in their operations and supply chain management program. So I do a lot of different things focusing on inventory reduction, cost reduction, scrap and waste reduction. I do a lot of things to help companies make sure they have supplies, which today is really tougher than ever because there's a lot of shortages going around, everything from baby formula to semiconductors and lots of things in between. But I'm a big believer in metrics and KPIs and doing some analysis and financial management. And so that's what I do. So I'm happy to be here to talk to you tonight. We're going to talk about PMI, and I'm going to show you some of the similarities in core values of the PMI, which I stole off some websites and supply chains. We're going to talk about project management applications in supply chains. There's a couple of areas where they're most prominent, and that relates to the product life cycle. So I'm going to kind of show all of those things together. I'm going to talk about some of the challenges that I see are shared between project management and managing supply chains, and why that when you combine the skills in that area, it can be very powerful and it's a winning combination. And then at the end, I'm going to do a little raffle and give away some prizes. So for anybody who would like to participate in the raffle, I do this via email. So I ask you to send me an email to jane@purplelink.co. And all you have to do is put in the subject like PMI or webinar or something like that so that I know which ones are from this group. And if you're not ready to do that now, I'll give you a chance at the end before I actually pull out my little random number generator feature on my phone and do that. I invite questions and comments, so feel free to do that while I'm talking. And you can also put things in the chat. I'll try to kind of monitor the chat, and maybe James, you could help me monitor in case I miss a question or something that comes up in the chat. Sometimes I get distracted a little bit. So if you can go ahead and want to participate in the raffle, I'll do that at the end. And in the meantime, let's just kind of jump in. So I'm going to start with defining the supply chain a little bit. People define supply chain a little differently. Some people focus on the manufacturing piece of that, which is very important. That's also called operations. And people use the term supply chain and operations interchangeably, which is not necessarily incorrect, but it's not fully correct either. So when you define the supply chain, you're really looking at suppliers, and this diagram doesn't have preceding suppliers, but the ones immediately before the manufacturing operation, we usually refer to as tier one suppliers, but they have suppliers and they have suppliers and they have suppliers. So you have that kind of chain there with tier two, tier three, and on down. And then after you take the raw materials and take the labor and actually do the manufacturing or producing a good or a service, then there are ways to get it to the customer. You can get it to the customer directly, or you can do that using distributors and retailers. Excuse me. Along this supply chain, you can see that there are arrows going both upstream and downstream. There's a flow of products, a flow of information, and a flow of funds. Excuse me. Oh, I'm sorry about that. I don't know why I got choked up, but we have all of those things flowing up and down the supply chain. Products and goods go from suppliers to manufacturers, ultimately to the customer, but there are customer returns, there are repairs, and there are things like that. There are rejects that come from manufacturers that get returned to suppliers, and they are from customers, retailers, and distributors, and they can go back upstream as well. Flow of information is very important, that we have information flowing up and down the supply chain all the time, so that people in these companies know what to do. They know how much to make, they know when to deliver it, they know what they're going to pay for it, they know any issues that are going on. So that information is constantly flowing up and down. Everything from phone calls and emails to point of sale data information that comes from customers that can go directly to like tier two and tier three suppliers if it's set up that way. And then the flow of funds. Obviously, customers are paying for goods and services, but manufacturers are paying suppliers. Suppliers are paying their suppliers. There's distributors and retailers in there. There's lots of money back and forth, accounts payable, accounts receivable. So there are funds flowing all through that supply chain. And they are not just a one-way thing either. They flow from manufacturers forward to distributors and retailers, because manufacturers pay for freight, they pay for distribution, and then sometimes distributors pay the manufacturer. So the funds go back and forth. Sometimes customers pay money down when they make a purchase, whether that is the ultimate customer or the manufacturer. And so there's funds going that way. And then again, there's returns and different kinds of checks and balances in that funds all along that line. So that's the basis of supply chain. And when I talk about a supply chain tonight, I'm going to talk about this whole thing in its entirety. So I'm going to talk about values first, because I think this is really one of the important areas. And this is something that the PMI that I know of, that I'm familiar with, it has very much in common with supply chain. So I think that there's a lot of overlap in these areas. For one, project management is worried about project management impact. And we have global impact from supply chains today. If you don't believe me, you can just take a little drive down the 405 to Long Beach and see what's going on at those ports. And you can see lots of things coming in and going out any day of the week, all hours of the day and night. So supply chains, and that's just one aspect of that. I had the opportunity to drive to Fresno in the last week to do a presentation and have some meetings up there. And I was driving on the 99, and the truck traffic between Los Angeles and that Bakersfield, Fresno, and farther north area is incredible. It's a 4-hour drive from here, and it was packed with trucks all along the way. So there's a lot of things that are moving, goods that are moving here and there. If you go to the cargo areas of LAX, you'll see a lot of different items getting shipped any day of the week, and all kinds of things, expedited freight. So there's truckers. You probably heard about trucker shortages, and rail cars are busy. Everything is busy with supply chain. So we are a consumer society, we do a lot of consumption, and so we need these goods and services to make our lives what they are today. But both organizations are strong on professionalism. Supply chain is no longer just looked at as a necessary part of the business. It's looked at as an integral part of the business. So for a long time, companies have had chief operating officer. So the operations was considered pretty important. But today you'll see a lot of chief procurement officers as well. That CPO title is fairly new, but more and more companies are establishing that because they realize that the procurement function, which is a big part of the supply chain, is also a C-level activity and handles so much of a company's money and is so vital to the company's success that they're creating chief procurement officer positions. Both organizations function a lot on volunteerism. PMI, this organization tonight, is a volunteer organization. Supply chain has a lot of volunteerism in that as well. I told you I have certifications from the Institute of Supply Management, but there are other organizations that are supply chain that rely a lot on volunteerism. Like it used to be called APICS. Now it's called ASCM, which is the Association for Supply Chain Management. And then there's an organization that functions a lot around the transportation and freight, which is CSCMP. I think it used to be the National Transportation Workers, not a union, but the national organization for people who worked in freight and transportation. Now it's called CSCMP, which is the Council for Supply Chain Management Professionals. So there's a lot of supply chain that goes into different organizations that all rely on volunteerism and trying to make the most of what they can to help people in these professions get more skills, hone these skills, because as I tell my students at CSUN, don't think that you're going to graduate and never have to go back and study or learn something else. You're always learning something else, whether you get something formal like a degree or a certification, or it's on the job training where you're trying to pick up a new software program or a new way of doing something, a new process. Diversity, equity, inclusion. I was pleased to see that as part of the PMI on the website, and supply chain values that very much as well. Diversity, equity, and inclusion applies not only to suppliers, to which it has for a long time. And if you're in the aerospace and defense business, you probably have requirements on getting diverse suppliers, small woman-owned businesses, lots of other categories in there for veteran-owned business, disabled veteran-owned, and there's a very long list now of all of these qualifications, categories of small businesses, which are very much encouraged by the federal government, which flows down in to aerospace and defense contracts. So if you work for Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, I worked for ITT, which is now part of, I think it's part of Hughes. No, not Hughes, it's part of Harris, L3 Harris. All of those have very much influence in the local area about buying from small and diverse suppliers. Equity is always something important in supply chain. Equity means not only across pay for personnel, but it means equity in suppliers as well. We try to make sure that we have suppliers who are giving us fair prices. We do a lot of work in supply chain and purchasing to make sure that we get equivalent bids and that we know what things cost, the value is, and that we have equity in the costing from suppliers to our companies. And then inclusion is just about making sure we are doing what we can across in supply chain, it's across the globe, because we want to include everyone from every walk of life, every whatever kind of labels we're putting on people. We're trying to make sure that we are including those and adding those to our supply chain to make it as strong as we can. Community is important to PMI. Supply chain really looks for suppliers who are aware of their community, who contribute to their community, and that business's impact on community, as well as the business that they're working for. So it's very important to make sure that we have the that sense of community within a company, as well as with our partners and our suppliers. Because if you have suppliers, that reflects on you as a company. So we're trying to make sure we have that covered, and that's one of the requirements for choosing suppliers. PMI has engagement and ethics. Supply chain has ethics, which is very important to any kind of business these days, but also sustainability. And I wouldn't be surprised to see that pop up on the PMI list of values in the next couple of years, because it's becoming more and more prevalent in all kinds of businesses. So you can see that both types of focus have a lot of the same values, which I think, again, makes them very compatible and to work together.
Excuse me, Jane, sorry to interrupt you, but for those of us that aren't really in the supply chain know, what do you mean by sustainability?
Sustainability goes to a couple different things. It's making sure that you can, the whole idea of sustainability is to not destroy the Earth's resources. That is to reuse, recycle, repurpose as much as we can. So we want to reduce the things that we use, reduce the waste, reduce the scrap, reduce the offal in all cases, and then make sure that we're recycling and reusing. And reusing can be through standardization of parts. It can be through reclaiming things like plastic, regrinding plastic, and also a way to kind of recycle. So it's all of those things, and it's making sure that that's throughout the supply chain. So within the manufacturing organization, and then as well, making sure that it's in the suppliers, in the distributors, in the retailers that we're doing business with, so that the values of the central corporation, usually the manufacturer, are reflected throughout the supply chain. Good question.
Thank you.
So there's some keys to both PMI management and supply chain management. And I think that those include customer needs and wants, and making sure that those are known, that those are shared, and that is the focus, because ultimately the PMI is about achieving goals, and there are company goals that supply chain is trying to meet. And those goals in the company are reflections of their customers, their current customers, and their desired customers. So that has to be a focus, and that has to be preeminent in the minds of everyone doing business, either as a project manager or in supply chain. These goals need to be defined. They need to be very clear. They need to be documented and shared across the organization. So I've worked on some projects that were pretty big with a lot of different functions involved. If that not everyone has the same understanding of the ultimate goal, the top level goal, there's going to be some problems. So alignment is very important. And even though you might have many, many different functions, many, many different factions working on the same project with their own set of goals, they all need to be in support of those top level goals. So that's very important. And in supply chain, it's the same way. You saw the number of different functions in a company that are involved in supply chain, everything from suppliers and supplier management to production, to managing the freight forwarders and the logistics companies that ultimately get product to the end customer. So we need those goals defined and shared across that supply chain in much the same way. If we don't have the same top level goals and everyone in the supply chain has the same understanding, then there's going to be problems. Like many other things in life, there are obligations from supply chain personnel and PMI personnel. We are supposed to do what we say we're going to do. We put plans together, and we are supposed to be able to use those plans to meet the goals and make sure that the company is supported throughout. Communication is very important. Identifying issues early and looking for options that address these, solving problems, that's very important in both project management, and it's very important in supply chain management. There are lots of things that can go wrong. I believe Murphy is alive and well, and he's usually where you don't want him, but he does pop up pretty frequently. So we all need to be prepared for that and look at how we can communicate those issues. Make sure that we're managing cost in all forms, because the cost in project management comes not only in dollars, but in time and in resources. And it does the same in supply chain. If things take longer than they were expected to, or it costs more money, that causes problems in another part of the supply chain, and it has to be coordinated and the issues worked out. And as always, we have to be aware of cost creep. So when we think something is done, sometimes it's not, and we end up seeing that the cost can continue to grow, or we don't have something completely solved, and then the cost can go up from that as well. And as we all know, time is money, and it's very important. So schedules are very important, both in supply chain and in project management. So project management and supply chain, and I put a couple of things here that are really some of the top level things. If you Google things like project management components, you'll see this list, and you can find a list of 3, 5, 7, whatever. I found a couple that I kind of liked, so I cited those here. One talks about resources, time, money, and scope or goals. So really kind of 4 components: the resources, the time, the money, and then the ultimate goals and the breadth of those goals. Another one talked about defining it in terms of the executive or the organizational needs, and put that as one of the main components, along with the policies and procedures that need to be followed in order to meet those needs. The schedules, of course, always in a component of project management, and then the budget, the dollars, the financials, however you want to define that. So I'm sure those are familiar to you. You might have some others that we could pick and choose, but if you look at those and relate those to supply chains, there are lots and lots of supply chain activities that require some part of project management. Some are pretty simple projects, some are a lot more complex. They start with baselines, because we need baselines for metrics to be tracking our progress, in the same way that in a project management application, you need to know what your baseline is. You need to know what you're measuring, how frequently you're measuring it, how the format and the technique for measurement, who's getting the reports and all of that. We need the same thing in supply chain. We have baselines that are internal to each part of the supply chain, just as well as each part of the project has their own set of metrics that they're measuring and that they're reporting on. And with again, with supply chain, suppliers are a key component of that. And we often have suppliers report to us on their projects to help craft and produce whatever it is that we need from that supplier. Both organizations, both types of people need goals. They need to have them coordinated with, in supply chain, they need to be coordinated with programs, which is often a lot of the project management, program management, but also with production and across the supply chain with other freight forwarders and retailers, distributors, all of that. The goals need to be defined in terms of scope, schedule, cost. We need to define the quality, and risk is a really important part of managing supply chains. And that's what project management is about. It's about managing not only the project, but the risks associated with that project, and to make sure that that project doesn't get derailed by risks that could crop up and that do crop up from time to time. They involve people as a resource, but there's other resources as well. In supply chains, we look at people, we look at equipment, we look at space in terms of capacity, we look at suppliers, we look at different types of space that we need: production space, inventory storage space, all kinds of different things. And in project management, there are any number of resources that can apply to any project, in addition to the people that are typically there all the time. So we have to manage the requirements in supply chain. In supply chain, we look at things from spreadsheet companies that manage everything on spreadsheets to very sophisticated ERPs like Oracle and SAP. and everything in between. So some things are very complicated, very complex, and others are very simple. Although I've seen some spreadsheets that are pretty complex and could kind of make your eyes water if you look at them for very long. They're pretty gnarly. Configuration management is very important to supply chain. It's important to PMI, but it's also important to supply chain in terms of managing the drawings and the specs and the levels that are changing throughout the course of making a product. So the configuration management takes on a little bit different look in project management, but it is still managing the configuration. Change management, always. We have lots and lots of changes going on. Sometimes they're planned changes, sometimes they're unplanned changes, sometimes they're necessary changes to resolve a problem or avoid a problem or do a lot of different things. But that's inherent in PMIs, but it's also very much in supply chain. In supply chain, we're always looking for process improvements. In project management, you're making sure that the processes are followed, and you're not necessarily trying to improve the processes as you use them, but you do take notes, and part of the lessons learned in a project, in a well-managed project, says, okay, what improvement and what things did we learn to improve in our processes, in our procedures? What can we take back and do better the next time? Supply chain, because it is everything from lower level suppliers to customers, requires a lot of communication, and it has to be very responsive to all of the things that can happen anywhere along that supply chain. So it's important that some of these project management techniques and ideas are also inherent in supply chain. So there's a lot of commonality between the two. And I'm going to show you one of the big places that we use formal project management in supply chain has to do with the product life cycle. And it has to do, and you can see which one I drew here, this little purple one, but typical product life cycles show the product development, the introduction, and often in supply chain or operations, we call this the launch, the growth phase where you're kind of, or ramping up, we call it in production, in operations, in supply chain. We have the maturity, or in operations supply chain, we call this the full production, max production. And then there's a decline. And I show this because we all start in the same place, whether you're the profits from this bottom line or you're the sales. And this is, again, it's usually a marketing kind of tool that's used for the product life cycle. But there are a lot of projects all along the way. So if we look at a product life cycle as a product and a program to manage, we're going to start with the product development. We're going to go into the introduction, growth, and we'll look at those one at a time. And I show you that the supply chain follows this pretty much the same. But supply chain actually is ahead of the introduction and the growth for most of this, because we need to build some inventory. We need to have some things in the pipeline from the suppliers and in our own production so that we have inventory that's going to satisfy the needs to make these sales possible. If we do a nice introduction and launch of this product, but there's nothing to sell, there's no inventory, or there's no people to deliver the services, then the market will very quickly lose interest or be put off by that, and they will go find a substitute, another company, or they will just say, I don't need it after all. So we have to be ahead of that curve, this sales curve, so that we do have the resources there, the inventory primarily, that's ready so that they can be sold. So we're building inventory up until this point. We build a little more inventory here, but I also show that we fall off a little bit earlier because we want to stop making things and stop creating, shut down that pipeline in terms of what suppliers have, what the production has, while we're still selling things. So when we quit making things, there's finished goods there, and we want to still be able to sell those at some kind of a reasonable profit. If we don't fall off fast enough, we can have too much inventory at the end, and that can erode our profits significantly. We can have to do fire sales on things and sell things for pennies on the dollar. So we're not recouping even close to the amount of cost that we have into the product, which is not a good place to be. So we really want to make sure that we have time to recoup the cost and the expenses that we've put into making these products, so we continue to sell them after we've stopped making them. So I'm going to look at these kind of one at a time. I'm going to start with the development piece itself. And in this area, this is usually a project management application in many companies to develop a new product. We start with a design, we do some design and development. Hopefully it's a cross-functional, collaborative type of project. Sometimes it's not, and then you have some issues with silos and getting everyone else on board and aligned. But in a good company, there are going to be collaborative efforts to design new products. We'll have the design, the development, we'll do some testing, maybe we'll make some beta units, some prototypes, we'll deploy those, we'll play with those a little bit, review those, test those out, go back through maybe a redesign again and update that. And then ultimately, we're going to have a product that we approve to launch. So this can be a project all by itself that just starts with getting that concept and idea to a point where you have a product that can actually be launched. So sometimes that project will continue. Sometimes it's a new project to actually get that project launched and into production. So the development stage includes a lot of schedules and budgets like everything else, cross-functional teams, which is the best, a lot of communication, documenting, because you're doing beta units, you're doing prototypes. It has a lot of innovation. And I once worked at a company where the design engineers were so reluctant to sign up to any schedule because they said to me over and over, you can't schedule innovation. And I said, well, I understand that, but I have to schedule something with suppliers. I have to have parts. I have to know some of this in order to be able to support you to even make prototypes or beta units. So it was not a very well-run engineering department in my estimation, because they liked the innovation part, but they really, really chafed under any kind of a process or a project management umbrella. And the company ultimately lost a lot of money and didn't get products out in time and paid some pretty high prices for that, for operating in that way. Because we do need these things. We need the documentation, we need schedules, we need to coordinate. Project managers coordinate across the stakeholders, and managers that are funding things so they have that coordination and they know what's going on. In supply chain, we coordinate across the stakeholders as well as suppliers, because they often become a very key stakeholder in the product, in a new product development. We need checkpoints and milestones to make sure that we're tracking, and that goes in supply chain, that goes for production, that goes for suppliers, that goes for being ready to receive the inventory, validating everything, all our assumptions, our concepts, our ideas. We want to make those prototypes and beta units and make sure that we're validating things and making sure everything works the way it's supposed to. And sometimes that's a whole project unto itself, just to proof it out, proof of concept. And we know that success in this development area yields continued projects or more additional projects for the company. And that's a good thing. Sometimes the project will die in this stage. If the stakeholders realize that they either can't produce what they're trying to produce, they can't make it work. Maybe it's a technology constraint. Sometimes it's a financial constraint. Yeah, we can make it work, but it's going to cost a lot of money to do that. And we don't have that kind of budget. Or we can produce one, but we can't do it on a production line type application, or we can't produce it for the amount of money that we can sell it for. Yeah, we can produce it. It looks great. We can do it in a production. We can do 100,000 a month, whatever the numbers are. But if the market isn't there, that's going to be able to pay the price that's going to yield enough profit for the company or enough margin for the company, then that product will get killed. So sometimes the projects die in this stage, not because they weren't well run, but because the results of the project say that this is not, it doesn't merit continuation, or it's too expensive at this time for the company to pursue.
Excuse
So
me,
then the
Jane, I have
next
a
state,
question. I'm
yes,
sorry to interrupt.
no, please.
What application, like in project management, a lot of times we use Microsoft Project, what software application do you use for the scheduling and that type of, profit loss analysis for the supply chain?
You can use the same thing. You can use Microsoft Project. You can use Excel sheets. You can use, there's another one that I can't think of right now that's pretty common for project management software. But any project management software will work. It's like most things, you might have to tailor it a little bit to your particular development, but often I've seen with the new product development use Microsoft Project.
Thank you.
Product launch is, again, very important. So oftentimes you get the proof of concept and then you say, all right, now we're going to go make some of these. We're going to finalize the design and we're going to actually launch it to the world. We're going to make an announcement. Think about Apple and what they do every September. Every September, now it's Tim Cook. It used to be Steve Jobs for years, has a big meeting. They bring all the reporters in and they say, here's our new product offerings here. And especially with the phone, they add other products in sometimes these days, but the phone, there's a new iPhone every year and they will talk about the new features, the changes, the updates, all of that. That's the launch. So they do that on a date in September, and that date is set pretty far ahead and it doesn't change. So everything needs to be ready to support that date. Everything backs off of that date. So I've worked on projects where we say, okay, here's where we are today. Now let's go figure out when we think we can accomplish this. So we start from a now position and project forward. Or in some cases, you say, I need to be done by this date, and then you back into that. I always use an example of like Olympic Games. Olympic Games are set ahead of time. Those dates are there, and all of the venues, all of the Olympic Village, all of the transportation, all of those things have to be ready on that date. You can't say, oh, I'm going to be a week late. That's not acceptable. That date is non-changeable. So that date is in concrete, very solidly, and everything has to be done in order to support that. So launch dates are similar to that. Typically, you set the launch date and you do not want to change it. So you make everything work to support that. You make sure that you have all hands on deck to make sure that you can make that date launch. Now, that doesn't mean that some companies keep that launch date pretty private until they get some level of confidence that they're going to be able to meet it. But in Apple's case, they know when that date is in September. You can look at a calendar and pick it out for the next umpteen years, because they do it the same time every year. So schedule is often very, very critical in the product launch. There's a lot of activities that have to be done both from a project management perspective and a supply chain. So from a project management, you're setting up your overall schedule, you're scheduling the announcement, and project management's often involved in what that announcement is going to contain. When do you start taking orders? How are you going to fulfill those orders? Who's going to fulfill those orders, and how is that going to all work? And then, of course, there's a budget for that. In supply chain, we need to coordinate the need dates, not only from the launch date, but back through production into suppliers and into suppliers. And believe me, today, with some of these lead times being absolutely crazy, for example, on semiconductors, I've seen 60-week lead times, 60, not 16, not 6 something, 60, which is over 1 year. So if it takes over 1 year to get parts, it's very hard to do your proof of concept and make sure everything's going to work, and then be able to schedule when your launch is going to be or how you're going to manage that. So, but supply chain's job is to take all of those different lead times and need dates and cycle times that are involved in production, and coordinate those and make sure that we have a plan so that we can have parts done on time to support that launch. So we have to allow for the production time. We're managing both inventories, we're managing incoming raw materials, components, subassemblies. We're managing inventory in WIP. How long is the cycle time? We're managing the finished goods inventory, not only how much, but where it's going to be, and where it's going to be held and what forms and on all of that. So how much do we hold in different places or all in one place? And then how do we actually do the order fulfillment? And then we're managing the cost of that too. We're managing the cost based on what the supplier quotes and proposals are. We're managing the cost of labor based on our estimates, our manufacturing engineers and all of that, and then supporting that product launch. So all of that has to come together as well to hit that launch date. And then we have that growth stage. So after we've done the launch, we have a little bit of a ramp. This is an area where I think a lot of the project management at this stage is really to observe and watch and report. So to keep doing the metrics, but in this growth stage, it often is pretty short these days. So it's not a lot of time. It's not 6 months or a year. And so you plan your growth and then you just make sure you're executing. So you typically, for project managers, they're making minor adjustments, and they're going along with the plan saying, okay, we thought we were going to be making 200 a week. Maybe we're only making 190, or maybe we're able to make a little more. So can we go ahead and accelerate that schedule, or are we going to stay where we wanted to be? So it's typically a lot of minor adjustments if things were done right ahead of that time. However, this growth for supply chain is a really critical area, and this is where lots of stuff can go wrong. So we can identify all kinds of issues, like quality issues, either from materials or from operations, from tools, from anything that's not working the way it was planned. Because again, all we've done is prototypes and beta units and a few small production, maybe one small production run. So now when we really start to crank, this is where all the wheels can come off. So we also have suppliers that are ramping up, and they can find problems as well. So this is where we uncover a lot of gaps. We find that we made bad estimates on something. We don't have something done on time. Some schedule thing is biting us, or. So lots of different things. We're also coordinating closely with marketing, because marketing is taking the feedback from these initial sales that they have that immediately follow the launch, the introduction, the announcement. And we're bringing those back in and saying, okay, do we have the right amount of things? Are we making the right size, the right color, any of that? Are we putting it in the right place? Or for example, here in the United States, did we estimate that this would be really big in New York, and we're finding out that it's big in Chicago, not so big in New York. So we have to move inventory, or we have to change our plan to ship more, the next amount of inventory that was supposed to go to New York because we thought they were going to be the fastest consumers. Now it needs to go to Chicago and maybe a place like Topeka, Kansas. So we're trying to adjust all of those things. In the same time, we're trying to modify our forecast to suppliers. Hey, great news. This product is taking off. The customers love it. They're buying it. They're buying our inventory as quickly as we can get there. So we need to ramp. Or guess what? It's not catching on as fast as we thought. Customers don't like the price. They don't like this. So we forecast at a level that's up here. And guess what? We're only seeing this. So now we need to slow everything down and not push too much, because we don't want these to build up too much inventory. So we are changing forecasts to our production units, to our production plans. We're changing forecasts to suppliers. We're relocating inventory. We're doing all of this, put the brakes on, now hit the accelerator. And a lot of times it's back and forth. For one day it's the accelerator and the next day it's the brakes. So we're trying to be very careful with that in this area, because this is very critical. If we can get through this in a good shape, then we have a good position to be in this maturity or production stage. So when it actually, the new product has been developed, launched, ramped into that growth, then oftentimes the project is complete, because either you had two projects, one for development, one for launch, or maybe the development project continued into the launch area. But once that's done, then the project management is not is replaced by standard operating procedures, is pretty much what it is. There is still an element of management and managing it, but it's not a special project. It becomes a standard operating procedure, and you're following the way we produce goods and services in the company, and it goes into more of a routine type mode than actual project management. We don't need a lot of extra people looking at it, because we have our normal supervisors, managers, and we have our metrics that are in place. So this is the time for the PMIs to wrap up this project, maybe get a new product and look at, hey, now we've launched version A, now let's go look at version B. So we might start with another one or the next generation product. So a lot of times PMI resources, mostly people, will peel off on that project. Some have already peeled off, as often happens. The resources wane as we get farther into the project, and then they are assigned to different projects. But for supply chain, we're doing, again, it's more routine, but we're still monitoring, reporting, tracking to our plans. We're looking at our forecast versus actual on a weekly, monthly, quarterly basis. We're managing the inventory. We're trying to reduce lead times and cycle times. We're focused on cost reduction. So in this maturity or production area, traditionally, once you get through the launch, then if you expect a very long mature cycle, production cycle, this is where a lot of the focus went on reducing the cost. But in tech products, the maturity cycle, the production cycle is not very long. So now all of the cost reduction efforts are being pushed early on into the development cycle, and even into that very first initial ramp stage for supply chain. The cost is, get the cost out before you get to that production level. And because there's not enough time to take it out after that, it really needs to be out from the very beginning. So, but more traditional products that have a much longer expected life, then that still can be the focus in that area, is to manage the cost. But we're always looking to manage the inventory, making sure the inventory is in the right place, looking at the lead times and cycle times. And again, for supply chain, you're focusing on, how can I improve my productivity, which is a ratio of the outputs to the inputs. So I'm looking at, okay, now I've got processes that are known, that are good. I can automate things. I can put trained people on it. So my output as a ratio to my inputs is going to be much higher, and my efficiency is going up because I'm doing things, making my goals with less resources, and being more efficient in how I manage everything. So in that maturity phase, that's where we have a lot of supply chain effort, but not as much project management. And then we get to the final stage, which is our decline or end of life. This is where products get replaced by another version, or products are deemed to have to not have the market value that they had before. Either they're getting obsolete, or again, they're being replaced by a newer version, or maybe a whole new product. If you think about, I use Apple a lot for examples. If you think about the Apple iPod, that was something that came out very early, and not all that long ago, Apple finally said, we don't need iPods anymore. We've got phones, and that's what people are using, and they don't need two pieces of equipment to manage their music. There's enough memory on most phones, or you're going to get cloud-based type things, and so you can use that to manage. So when you get to this end of life, this is, it might be you bringing back in PMI people to close out contracts that were part of that, or sometimes that they just use I'm sorry, they just refer that to the routine closeout processes. For SCM, this requires significant oversight because we are managing our raw materials and our supplier forecasts, again, with very long lead times, sometimes 6, 8, 12, 10, 26 weeks for parts. You have to tell the suppliers, stop, don't make anything after this date. And then when those parts are done, our production needs to be ending as well. So we get the parts from the suppliers, then we manage the production, use up as much of the raw materials as we can and as we plan to do. We generally keep some raw material for things like repairs and spares and things like that, but that all has to be forecast and identified. Then we have contract closeouts, if that's applicable. Sometimes they're just purchase orders that need to be closed. Sometimes they're full-on contracts. We do the transition in production. So we ramp that down. We reallocate equipment, people, space, do relayouts in the factory and close down different production lines or reconfigure that production line for another product, retrain people, get them on new products, move them around. And then the same with inventory. We're disposing of excess inventory, managing that as closely as we can so that we don't have a lot of unmatched sets of inventory and we can, or a lot of extra inventory after we're finished that we have to write off. So that includes both the raw, the work in process, and the finished goods. And we have a plan for how all that is going to be used or sold or taken care of so that it doesn't remain in limbo on our financial books. So that's our decline end of life. So there are a lot of shared challenges in doing this. And some of those challenges come from the fact that both supply chain and project management are heavily involved in matrix management. And this often says you've got a lot of responsibility and you're accountable for a lot of things, but guess what? You're not actually managing all of these things. You have to use your influence and persuasion, and across both a project and supply chains, you've got a lot of people with different skills, different competencies, different levels that are all involved in these all along the way. So it takes a lot of management skills, and they're both highly matrixed. But both supply chain by itself and typical project management projects have potential for huge positive contribution to a company. A company doesn't fund a project unless they expect to get a return on their investment. And supply chain in and of itself is kind of a project that has to always be delivering what it's supposed to support the goals of the company. And if we're not doing this right, or if we're making incorrect decisions, then it can have a huge negative impact on the company too. So that goes back to that accountability, responsibility, all those things. There is risk in every piece of the project management usually, and there is risk in every aspect, every little node along that supply chain. So you have to understand those risks, identify those, put mitigation plans in place, and make activities to reduce the risk or reduce the impact from the risk. Skills that are needed that are analytic skills, financial skills. We're always hitting moving targets because things are changing, they're volatile, and change management is hard. So a lot of times major projects in a company involve a lot of change management, and supply chain is the same way. We have to manage very carefully all the aspects of a product, but also we have to manage going from one product to another. So it's good to be flexible, and it's good to have some leadership skills that can help you manage along the way. Supply chains are very complex today. Supply chains are global, and you can talk to companies who say, well, we really don't buy, we don't import anything, and we really don't buy that. And I say, well, show me what your bills of material are, show me what you make, and I'll tell you where the global aspects are of that. Much of the aluminum and steel that's used today in any product does not come from the United States. Electronic components, so if there's any electrical aspect of something that you're making that has a lot of different countries it can come from. Everything from China to Indonesia to Malaysia to Korea to Japan to the Philippines. and Thailand and many others. So there's a lot of potential for where things can come from. Um, in supply chain, you have these functions and they may be located in different countries, different time zones, different across the world. So, and we also know that in supply chain, these cycle times can be long. I just told you some of these parts have 60-week lead times. So that's a pretty long cycle time to be trying to order things and make sure it's coming in, and then it continues to come in when it's supposed to. So we're coordinating in supply chain across companies, across time zones, from one function to another, including design and quality and finance and import export people. We're worried about currencies and political changes and the forecast changing, because I gave my suppliers the best forecast I could. And 2 weeks later, you give me another forecast that's either double or half of what I gave them. So now I have to update and go back to them and try to work through all of this, which can be very, very difficult. So we have all of these complexities in supply chain, and that goes to managing these types of projects. These complexities are in there in a project management aspect as well. But supply chain requires coordination throughout the supply chain, and PMI is focused on coordination throughout the project, throughout the various activities going on. So there's a lot of similarities there. If in supply chain we use project management tools and templates, it really helps make our lives easier. So many of the people I know that work in supply chain maybe aren't members of PMI-LA, and maybe they don't have PMP certifications, but they are good project managers because they've had to learn those tools and techniques, and that many have taken courses in that, seminars, and learned something about project management. Earned value management is something I said I worked in defense and aerospace. So earned value management is a part of most contracts. And so all aspects, every function involved in that gets a little bit of a mini course in earned value management. We need to understand our suppliers' needs, understand their wants, and see if we can't add some wants in while we're getting their needs, making sure that we define the goals and the activities all along the way. Communication is very, very important, both up and down. So up and down the supply chain, but also up and down the project, because project managers have to report regularly to whoever the sponsors are, whoever the champions are, whoever's got the purse strings, the executive teams that are managing these projects overall or overseeing those. So that's very important. That communication needs to be both detailed and frequent. It's very important that we use those project management tools for communication all through the supply chain. And so if we unite these skills, it's a really powerful combination for a company. So what I know for sure is there's a better way. Purple Link shows companies there's a better way. So it's important to know the ultimate goals, the top level goals, and that make sure all the key stakeholders are familiar with those goals, and then you're familiar with other interfacing activities. So you can't just be in your own silo. You have to know what the other parts of the project are doing, because you can have one group that's just doing so well, really great, firing on all cylinders, and another part of the project that's in the mud and dragging and whatever. So you can't let that one necessarily keep going at that pace if you've got somebody that's not keeping up. So you've got to be able to manage that. And so you've got to know what the other interfacing and complementary aspects of the project or the supply chain are doing and how well they're performing, so that you can manage your part of that as well. You can't have everybody at different paces, or it's not all going to come together. So productivity and efficiency matter all across the supply chain and all throughout the project. You want the project to be as productive and efficient as possible, and every piece of that should be striving to achieve those individual productivity and efficiencies. Utilizing the PMI approach can work in tons of applications. You clearly define a scope of work, manage your resources, the people, the time, the money involved, make sure you communicate clearly and often. And finally, both in project management and supply chain, we need to ask for help before damage is really severe or irreversible. A good project manager knows that they need to alert the senior people or the important stakeholders, the champion, the sponsor, that, hey, we might have a problem. This is what we're doing about it. We're going to check, but I will keep you informed. That is a much better approach than waiting until something goes pretty askew and coming in and saying, hey, guess what? We had a major issue last week and blah, 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 blah. So it's good to ask for help before something gets too out of control. And early warning signals are a good thing. So PMI skills can apply to many aspects of the supply chain. I want you to think about what opportunities might be in your company. Where are you managing costs, schedules, and risks, and how are they being managed? You do this as project managers anyway, program managers, but think about in your supply chain where this might occur and who might need assistance either in your company or someone that you know or work with, or a company that you interface with. So if this is the situation, then help is available. You can take the first step and you can call me to talk about it. I have my calendar is set up with free half-hour calls that I'm happy to talk about any of the subjects, anything about supply chain, any other aspects of business that might interface or apply to the project management. So I'm available and more than happy to talk to people about any of these subjects. You just do the callwithjane.com and schedule it at your convenience. And if that doesn't work, you can always send me an email. So I'm going to give you some time to do that in the next couple of days. And then I'm going to right now, I'm going to give you about another minute or so to enter the prize drawing. So I'm having a raffle here shortly. You need to send me an email to jane@purplelink.co and put PMI or webinar in the subject. And then I'm going to take a look and see how many people we have signed up. And I am going to use this little fancy random number generator on my phone, which is pretty easy app to download in case you need that. And then I'm going to pick somebody if my phone will refresh right now. And you'll get, if you want the slides, you need to send me an email. So everyone that sends me the slides, I will give, everyone that sends me an email will get the slides from me as well. So you'll get that in a PDF in a follow-up from here. And you'll get signed up for my dynamic dialogue, which is a monthly webinar that I do. And whoever gets chosen tonight will get a $25 gift card. So my phone is not refreshing somehow. Let me see if
Hello, everyone. This is James. Sorry to interrupt, Jane. Before we wrap, does anyone have any questions that they would like to add? Please put them in a chat.
Put them in the chat or just ask. Just unmute yourself and ask. Okay, so it looks like Greg Shimabukuro, and I apologize if I didn't pronounce that correctly, but Greg, you are the winner. So I have an email, and if that's an okay email to use, I will send you the Amazon gift card via email. And then I want to leave you with one thing, because I always think that it's important to leave on a positive note with a strive to thrive that you might think about for tomorrow and the next few days. This comes from William Pollard, and William Pollard said, learning and innovation go hand in hand. The arrogance of success is to think that what you did yesterday will be sufficient for tomorrow. And I think that's pretty profound, especially given that William Pollard died in 1989. He was born in 1911. He started his career as a professor of physics at the University of Tennessee. He also, along the way in his life, became an Episcopal priest. So he was asked in 1946 to champion part of the Oak Ridge Institute of Nuclear Studies, which ultimately became the Manhattan Project. So he worked on that, which I also think was interesting because that spiritual piece of being an ordained priest and also working in this science level is a unique combination, but it can be very powerful. So he co-authored a lot of material about Christianity and science, and is often referred to as the atomic deacon. So he was an interesting individual, but I think this is as applicable today as it was probably 75 years ago when he wrote it, because we know that thinking what we did yesterday is not going to be enough for tomorrow. So I'll take questions, comments, anything. If you have any of that before we sign off for the night.
Jane, this is James again. How do you evaluate